Welcome, everyone. We still have folks joining, but we want to be respectful of your time. So we are going to get going with our April Readiness Projects Changing the Odds Thought Leader interview, hosted as always by Karen Pittman. We're so excited to have you here to join us for today's conversation, Making It What Today's Kids Need for Tomorrow's World, which is also the title of Stephanie Malia Krauss's new book. So we're really excited to have Stephanie here to talk with Karen today. Stephanie's work sits at the intersection of education, human services, and workforce development. She is currently a senior advisor to Jobs for the Future and a staff consultant for the Youth Transition Funders Group. And as I mentioned, the author of a new book. So Stephanie, welcome. We're so excited to have you here. Karen, I will hand it off to you to start our conversation.
Wonderful. I'm just delighted to do this, and the time is going to go fast. So get your questions ready to throw in the chat. Stephanie and I have known each other for years, and we both talk very fast, but we both also get very excited. So let me just sort of add a little bit to Catherine's welcome to Stephanie. I met Stephanie and I actually have written the foreword to the book, Truth in Advertising. But I met Stephanie in St. Louis at a conference, and within 10 minutes of a conversation about what she'd been doing, we knew that we were going to need to work together. And I'll let her tell you more about that story. But specifically, Stephanie joined us at the forum for a couple of years to be a senior education fellow, because she was the person that I knew after talking to her was up to the task of answering a question that was really plaguing me. When we think about what we're now sort of talking about as this community learning and development ecosystem, like thinking about all of the places where young people spend their time, voluntarily, involuntarily, where do they spend their time? At that point, 5 years ago, there was so much going on about the conversation about social emotional skills, life skills, readiness, competencies, 21st century skills. Every system and sector was having a conversation about what readiness looks like for young people, but the language was deafening. But we knew that there was potential there to pull it together. And we also knew that behind this conversation about what it took for young people to be ready, there was also a conversation about what we needed to do as adults to help prepare them. So when Stephanie had a reason to say, I need a break and I want something to do, I handed her that just minor task of looking across all of the systems where young people spend their time and really figuring out what the science is telling us and how that's being brought into these systems. That ended up being something that we ended up calling my Ready by Design. And it was our first foray into really trying to galvanize this. But Stephanie didn't stop there. She's continued to sort of grapple with this idea of readiness, and it has culminated in the book, Making It. And I'm going to hand it over to her to really sort of tell you where that journey has gone since, well, even before what she was doing before, how the Readiness by Design work and the Readiness Projects work got her started, and what got her to where she is now. And I will tell you right now, get your pens and credit cards ready, because this is a book worth having on your shelves. So Stephanie, welcome. So glad to have you on the screen. Just get us started about the journey that started when you were running a charter school to JFF to what compelled you to put this book out.
Thanks, Karen. And I have to agree with you. Karen and I do talk in shorthand and long form and super quickly and get very excited. And when I get excited, I am Hawaiian and Jewish, and generationally tend to move my hands very fast. And so I'll try to sit on them while answering your questions. But, it's so interesting. I will sometimes go and speak to classes about careers and, what my story and journey have been. And one of the things that has been clear to me for years now, as you know, is that for me, the work has always been about a question, a driving missional question, which is, what actually do young people need to be ready? And what does that require of all of us? What will it really take? You and I have talked for years now about what would it mean if we viewed youth readiness as a right. And that story starts with my own, and then it weaves through time as a classroom teacher and a coach and in counseling. But ultimately, the space in which you and I met was I had left the classroom. I knew that I loved teaching. And I still love teaching and education, but there was so much else that was impacting my students. And so I left the classroom for social work school. And in the middle of going to social work school, I was invited by the mayor's office in the city of St. Louis to start a school for young people. At the time, the term of the day was disconnected youth. These were young people who were not in school, not in work, who had been pushed or pulled out. We call the same young people opportunity youth today, and there's a lot of movement in field work around them, but there wasn't at the time. At the time, there was just kind of this hemorrhage out of the comprehensive high schools in St. Louis City. And while we had great human service providers, there wasn't a school for them. And so the way that Karen and I met was actually at the end of a painful process that was a promise to the community, which was that I would help start a school for disconnected youth, but would only keep it open if it worked. And if we were able to do what we knew was in the best interest of young people. And so we had pulled together a program design. It was the first competency-based school in not only the city of St. Louis, but in the state of Missouri, where we had identified 21 competencies that young people needed before their 21st birthday. So for anybody who's been a long time friend to the forum, you'll see already that the DNA here is thick in the relationship. This was prior to Ready by 21, and yet we were trying this 21 by 21 model. And as Karen will quickly tell you, it was an unbalanced model. We had to take all of these academic standards that young people had to be proficient in as deemed by the state of Missouri. And it was not always congruent to what they actually needed to know in order to be ready for college and careers. And so in designing a school, running it really as an experiment, and then running a local nonprofit that was doing policy and program change, a few years into it, just before I met Karen in the forum, we had come into a real ethical dilemma. And that was that the mission of our work was to re-engage disconnected youth back into school and graduate them ready for what came next. And that we realized that was not actually the same thing as graduating high school, that they could get a credential and it was really proxy for readiness, and it didn't match all of the resources, supports, internal assets that they were going to need. And so we made a really painful political decision to close the school. We couldn't do what we had set out to do. And in that process, I met Karen and the forum and explained how we had looked at the research. We had done our best job at pulling together partners. We had 12 partners. We were on a technical college campus. We had all the bells and whistles of youth development and education, but we couldn't do everything. And so our question was the same, her coming from national work and the forum, and me coming from the ground, which was, what actually do young people need to be ready? And so as Karen mentioned, she and I and our colleague, Caitlin Johnson with Spark Action, set out on this multi-year journey to look at the science and to look at the systems and sectors and figure out, if it's not a state or a system telling you what's required to get through or to complete, but instead looking at the young person and their whole life and their whole context, what do they need? And then as Karen mentioned, what does that take from us as the adults and as the environments and systems? When the readiness, that was the original readiness project, and Ready by Design is in the chat and you can find that. When that completed, I actually shifted away from the forum for a few years, although have stayed in strong friendship, and shifted into the higher ed workforce space. And I'll say, and Karen, you and I have not talked about this a lot, but there's so much that was learned on that side that I didn't have a full, deep understanding of in terms of how does the world of work work and what is happening in the economy and society, and how is the higher education space changing rapidly. And I would love the chance for us to do the research again and to look at the future of work and to look at what has happened in the pandemic life, in our communities and in our cities. I think for all of us on today's call who come from a youth work space, we have to know what is happening in the adult life part and in the future forecasting part in order to plan with that end in mind. And that's why Making It was written. I'll pause here in a second so that we can dig in, but I'll say that Making It as a book was really my love letter 8 years later back to the front lines, to anybody who was raising or educating or coaching or counseling kids, because it incorporates the good research that Karen and I got to do together. But also what was learned since in that future of work higher education space.
That's a great start to get us rolling on this. And you said a thing that is no longer provocative, that one of the reasons that sadly you ended up sort of closing the school was it was clear that the journey to make sure young people really had the competencies they needed to have didn't really align with the pressure to give them a credential and move them out of the system on time or as soon as possible. And so that's why we have to sort of rethink this whole thing. And it's really one of the reasons why in the kickoff conversation for the Changing the Odds discussion series, we had Kelly Young on from Education Reimagined. Today, we're just reimagining readiness, even broader than reimagining a single system. So it's really timely to sort of push this conversation out. But Stephanie, I love to alliterate. So that, when I picked up the book and saw that you were talking about the 4 currencies of, competencies, credentials, connections, and cash, you had me right there. Not only, that they all start with C, which is one of my personal favorite letters, kind of like Cookie Monster, but also because they really are very practical and accessible words, and anybody can understand immediately, just at a basic level. Well, that makes sense. But now let's dig in a little more to why it makes sense, and start with competencies, because as you said, clearly we need young people to have a full range of competencies, but we often get the balance wrong, depending on who we are, which organization we are. Not only is there just a lot of language noise, there's also an inevitable imbalance in what's really needed. So when you really dug in again to look at competencies, what are we talking about?
Yeah, so first I have to confess to you, I don't think I've told you this. In the middle of writing the book, I called someone. I know we've got some folks from Virginia on the line. So this was a friend who does communications work in Richmond. And I said, how much alliteration is too much alliteration? Like, I need you to pull me back here. And that is one of the many things Karen and I have always connected on. There was more alliteration that did not make its way into the book. I will tell you that. But I think, so these competencies for anybody on the line who is doing social emotional learning programs or competency-based education or competency-based programming, the competencies that I talk about in the book are similar, but also a little bit different. And they really do come out of, if you go onto the chat and you download Ready by Design, this really is the cornerstone, the ability that we had for paid time to really soak in the research and science continues to pay out dividends. But I'll explain it this way. So we have our body systems, and this is something you and I, talked about and developed together. And our body systems are hugely interdependent. If I go for a run and my heart rate increases, so does my respiration rate. Similarly, if I am super cold, that's going to have a relationship on other parts of my body, what's happening with my skin or whatever else. So we've got these physical body systems, and that is how we function as bodies in the world. And then there is this more invisible set of competencies, which is our ways of being in the world. And they are as interdependent as those physical body systems. We often understand them best when they're not happening. So I might not key into my own child or children, my boys, when they are really focused and paying attention. But man, do I know when they're not focused and not paying attention. And so we see that there are these 10. I mean, I remember when you and Caitlin and I arrived at 10 in the science, and then it was so exciting that, you know, it was going to be a number easy to remember. But these are things that you will find in SEL programming, youth development programming, 21st century skills, all of the different sets. And there are ways of being and doing in the world. They are things like what I just mentioned, being able to focus and pay attention, being able to feel and express emotion, being able to think critically, being able to regulate. And I think one of the things that, again, used to be provocative and thankfully isn't anymore is we now know from the science that these are things that can be learned and strengthened and practiced over time, increasingly that we can assess them, or like I said, as a mom, the absence of them when they're not happening. But they're what fuel and power us. And I think one of the pieces that was really important for me and new and different for folks who are on the line and thinking like, yeah, well, I know this, like I know kids need to be able to think creatively and critically, and organization is hard and important. But what is, I think, different and new is in the context of what moment. So when we look back at this pandemic year and we think about it being emblematic of the kind of stress and strain and trauma and hardship, the overwhelm and overloading aspects of what it is to be a kid today, and then what it is to be a kid if you are in any way held back or harmed because of who you are, where you live, or what's happening. It demands new and different things of us to be able to do it. So I cannot think creatively if I'm in a place of perpetual crisis and my health is really on the line, or my ability to feel and express emotions is going to be in direct relationship to how I'm doing in processing what's going on inside. And so what I tried to do in the book was to give language that was neutral to any sort of program or set that you might have, but also be very clear that there are really easy, free things to do that help to develop and strengthen them. One of my favorite examples of that, just really quickly, is that because young people today are sort of, I was just sharing this the other day, growing up, you know, your two grandsons who live in the same place as my two boys and are growing up in an era of YouTube clips and video clips. Sometimes my son Justice, who Kieran's known for almost all his life, he's upstairs with his transistor radio ready for opening day to listen to the baseball game. And the simple act of listening to something from start to finish is actually a way that he can practice focus in an era where he's used to these YouTube clips that just change every 30 to 45 seconds. Oh, Karen, you are on mute.
Yes, I figured that out. One of the things that we did in Ready by Design that you brought into this, which I think is important to emphasize, and you said it, is the value of focusing on the consistency of saying what young people need is the ability to, and just that shift of they need the ability to do this. And we know that ability or readiness is a combination of I actually have the skill to do it, but I also really understand how to bring that skill into an opportunity and combine it with other abilities. And so, you know, as we talk about this idea of competence, It really is important for us to raise it up out of individual skill language into this package. And when we did this, we talked about young people having sort of a backpack of things that they carried around with them, and they would know which ones to pull out depending on the situation. So the flexibility that you're talking about is really important. Now, you've already said that, we really are not doing a very good job of not only sort of naming and appreciating the interconnection between the competencies, but making an explicit connection between whether young people really have built up a full backpack of competencies and rewarding that with some kind of credential. So you've been in the workspace, you've been in the higher ed space. Why are credentials important if they are so imbalanced in what they're signaling? Why did you make them a C?
That's a good question. So I want to maybe say two quick things before we dive into credentials. One is back to competency, and it's from an equity perspective. I think it's important for folks to consider, and likely the folks on this call already are. But then the second is what even are the C's and what are they not? And I know that we'll dig into that a little bit later on. So the one thing that I'll just mention about competencies, and it's really true across all four currencies, is that context matters. And what is demanded of us in any situation is going to really matter. So for instance, back to the body systems, that same baseball loving son, Justice, as you know, Karen, has asthma and has since he was little. What he has to do to keep his lungs healthy and then subsequently all of the other parts of his body is going to look different from me. I don't have asthma. If a young person comes into a classroom, let's say, and does not feel safe and secure, their ability to focus, to organize, sorry, everybody, this is my attempt to keep myself on time. See, I'm trying to self-regulate right here.
How are you doing?
It's always questionable. But one child to the next in any learning system or setting is going to require different levels of competencies based on what they're experiencing and who they are.
Right.
And we need to understand that and develop it differently. It's going to look different. So the currencies, importantly, are expendable resources. They are things we can learn and acquire, but also they can be depleted and spent out. Just like money, we can save it, we can spend it. But these are the things that you need that the world recognizes as valuable as you navigate opportunities and purchase opportunities. And so credentials lives in that space. So let me say, like, I would be a terrible educator if I didn't say there are absolutely educational environments, schools, college programs that are graduating students with the knowledge, skills, habits, dispositions that they need for what comes next. And it is not always the case. And in some spaces, it is rarely the case. I think when I started Shearwater for young people who had been pushed or pulled out of school, I didn't realize how many kids had been pulled through school, had been allowed to stay, and they didn't have what they needed. And they were going to be let out into the world with a diploma that said yes. At the same time, the currencies are, what do you need in a world that is still unfair and unjust and operating by a set of rules that is not always right, but are the rules that we operate by. And in the employer space and in the college space, more often than not, you need the degree. And then more often than not, that degree has a relationship to pedigree. And it actually has more to do with what the institution or brand power of that particular degree brings with it. So there are a couple of spaces that are important to know. So I'm looking at Dara's question in terms of
Mhm.
examples of currencies and ways that you use the term. So currencies, again, are what are the things that young people need to acquire, whether it's skills and habits in the competencies. Credentials are the actual pieces of paper that say, yeah, I completed this thing that you say is a prerequisite to being able to do the next
Mhm.
thing that says that I'm valid. And then we'll talk in a little bit about connections and cash, so
Yeah.
social capital and financial resource. But these credentials, number one, employers still require them more often than not to be even eligible for a work opportunity. Or a college will require that GED or high school diploma. We know that. But then again, that pedigree as degree actually shows up so much more often than I think we really pay attention to. And in fact, I think that we perpetuate inequity when we tell young people, particularly from poorer communities, if you just get the credential or you're just skilled enough, you're going to be okay. Because they can get a credential from the local community college and they can go and it not be recognized in the same way. They could be more skilled
Right.
than another applicant, right, with a better recognized degree. So we know that for now, the research still says that if you have credentials, you're going to make more money. You are going to be more likely to be hired for a job, and those other determinants of life, happiness, success, are higher simply by having it, even if it's not always reflective of what you need for what comes next.
Right. So I think that's great. And I want us to go ahead and move on to connections because we're already at the halfway point in the conversation. But to Dara's question, I think we can, when we get to the end of this, we sort of talk about equity, and it's not just that, you've got credentials that have different pedigrees associated with them. To your point about expending currencies, young people have to expend a disproportionate amount of currency to get to a credential, depending on what kind of situation they're in, or there may be a mismatch between the competencies that they have and the competencies that are really seen, valued, and appreciated and associated with a particular credential. So we've got folks on the call who are coming from a range of systems and settings and organizations that all want to work on those competencies, but they don't all have equal access to a credentialing process. And so if we're going to think big and bold, and we're going to say credentials are important, a conversation for all of us to have is, then how do we broaden credentials so that there's more of a match? There's more of an opportunity for you to say, I really have a lot of competencies and ability in this area. How do I get credit for that? Because we're not working on a competency-based system that is the kind that you tried to set up. We're working on a system in which a very narrow set of competencies get used to sort of funnel into, academic skills, which then gets you a credential. So that's a longer conversation we could have, but I just wanted to sort of put that out there because part of what we can do when we're reimagining education is reimagine the connection between competencies fully defined and a broader array of credentials so that we can get to equity and have more young people have more pathways into having these currencies to be able to use.
Really super quick, 15 seconds. We'll try for 15 seconds. Because of who the folks are who are on the call, I want to say two things that are explained deeply in the book, but are important new insights that I didn't have when I was at the forum that are in the book about credentials. The first thing is there are hundreds of thousands more credentials every year at this point, because there's another C, college, and I didn't use it. I used credentials instead of college. More than half of post-secondary education credentials today are not issued by universities. And so for anyone on the line who's thinking about college and career readiness, we have to understand just how different that post-secondary education space is.
That's great. No, that's perfect. I wasn't looking by seconds, but that was short. And we can add into that because there are folks on the call and sort of in the field who are also working at sort of the micro credentialing level, whether we're talking about badges or certificates or other things that young people can get. So there's an exciting conversation to have there about how we get more opportunities for linking and acknowledging competencies as they connect to credentials. But let's move on to the really important one. You said the other C word that you didn't put in is currency, which was context. And that's going to come back in terms of when we really sort of think about equity. But context is so important, and talk about how context connects to connections. And what did you mean by connections? Because I love the way you really define connections in the book. So talk a little bit about connections.
Oh, okay. But I know there's someone on the line from Mentor. And so I'll be so curious I'm trying to watch the chat as we talk, because the connections chapter really starts with what I believe strongly, which is that probably everybody on this call knows that the research is well founded, that one caring adult will make a big difference. But what I talk about is, yes, and gosh, it's so much better if there's more than one. And what do we know about the web of social support, or the network of social support that young people need, again, in navigating? I should mention at this point, because I haven't said it explicitly, let me turn this timer off, I apologize, that this is not a book about how kids thrive. This is a book about how they make it through life. What is it that they need to be ready for what is coming at them, and what life is going to look like after high school? And I say that because there are more C's: community, culture, all kinds of things in social relationships that are vital for thriving. But at baseline and just navigating life, I don't give that a deep treatment. What I do talk about are 3 different kinds of relationships that young people need in order to make it through adolescence and then into and through adulthood. And it's based in the context of what the research says now, is that kids could live a very long time. There's a possibility with the right resources and supports, they could live as long as 100. So this possibility, it's not guaranteed. Certainly we know, depending on where a kid is or what's happening, but this possibility of a 100-year life in a very volatile time, I would say connections might be the most important of the currencies, that our need for social stability and social strength and social mobility, social capital, could in fact be the most important. And I probably could argue against myself, but I think I believe that. So the lifelines are those mentors, family, friends, the people who have our back, the folks we really think about a lot in youth development. But then I also talk about navigators, your near peers, and door openers, which can be programs or people. And some of these relationships don't have to be forever relationships, and some can switch over time. Someone might open a door for you and then become a mentor. I think that's our relationship. You open the door to the forum and now you're stuck with me for the rest of your life. You've become this anchor lifeline, but it didn't start as that. I think we could have imagined it, but it wasn't where it started. And so recognizing the ways in which young people, based on race, based on status, based on family, based on geography, are born with social bank accounts in the same way as cash. And there's social wealth, which gets spent out in these opportunity transactions, is really crucial. So young people need all 3. And the one, again, similar to the changing post-secondary marketplace, I'll say one interesting thing I learned while writing the book is that near peers might be more important than ever before. So when we think about young people, just a year or 2 ahead, because life is changing so quickly and the world of work is changing so quickly, actually having folks in your life who are just one stage ahead of you to reflect has become really crucial, because the context is shifting, and they're going to have maybe keener, sharper insights than those of us who went through something years ago.
So talk a little bit about where connections are found. Like if you're giving advice to folks on this phone or on this call, some of whom are running programs or managing programs or funding programs or thinking about them, some of whom are adults who are developing individual relationships. What is the soil from which connections grow? Where do young people go to look for connections? Where do they avoid connections? Talk a little bit about that context and connections. How do they go together?
So first off, connections are found in any space or place where young people spend time, and they can be found and nurtured in person or online. I'm sure everybody can map their own lives to that reality. And we need to think again about that social and emotional health and wealth piece. So where are the connections in a young person's life that contribute to their social health? And where are the connections in a young person's life that contribute to their social wealth that they can actually use and spend out to purchase learning and work opportunities or mobility opportunities? So at the social health side, I mean, this is the people around them, whether it's family of origin or chosen family, the friends in their lives, faith community, right? Any system or setting where they are. These are the people that have their backs. And because of this long life in a volatile time, the need for us as educators and youth workers to spend time there, to recognize its importance as equal to preparation, being productive is crucial. You know, it's never been as important as it is today, that social stability and the good stuff of relationships. On the social wealth side, this really concerns me for the pandemic year, because you think about, if we think about juniors and seniors in high school, for example, there are a set of social activities and relationships and opportunities that for many, they only get in school or they only get through youth programs. And when those things shut down, wealthier and more well-off kids, predominantly white, had the opportunity to continue to sort of, you know, they had these connections that are just banking social interest, so to speak, that will continue to get them into the colleges, universities, internships, jobs, anything that they might need. But for students who in the past year lost out on these extras of sports, arts, music, you know, other programming, things that will yield scholarships or letters of recommendation or internships or other opportunities, it's going to be hard to recoup that. And so, you know, I think we understand schools as a place. I think that the world better understands what many of us on the line have long felt, which is that it's sort of an anchored center that a lot more than learning happens in. And so being deliberate in understanding how social connections lead to scholarships, lead to opportunities later on, or lead to internships that pay versus internships that don't, or whatever else. So we have to design deliberately for those opportunities, and they show up wherever kids spend time.
Good, good. So the last C is somewhat obvious, but we don't want to skip over it before we start to wrap up. So you put in cash, and I think there was actually even some, in addition to alliterating, there was really some value in really saying cash and not just access to financial aid or whatever. So, you know, let's get to that last C and how it connects. Clearly, that is the currency that most people walk around with, or the equivalent in a credit card. But why and how does it fit in with the others?
Yeah, so this was, while I was drafting the book, I connected with colleagues at the Economic Security Project, which if you haven't heard of ESP, you should go look them up. And I said, you know, do I put it first? Do I put it last? And I ended up putting cash last, really as a signal to say, you can have all of these things. You can have great relationships. You can be super skilled. You can make it through. But if you don't have this very basic resource and enough of it, nothing else matters. And I think that this was, for me, the like strongest sort of provocative piece. I am ashamed, and I'll use that word. I think it's strong enough. I'm ashamed of the level, at the level to which in education, cash matters and we don't talk about it. We don't ever talk about, or we don't talk enough about how much it matters, how a family or how a young person is financially in relationship to how they learn in the moment and how they're going to do later on. Because how they are faring economically is going to have, I mean, you obviously know this, like we're talking to each other about this, but also the folks on the line, how they're doing in that moment and how their family is doing and what that does to them is going to impact what learning looks like in the moment. And are they in the scarcity mindset? And are they hungry? And what is happening? And how is quality of living and quality of learning really linked? And how do we understand that relationship? But then there's the preparation piece. So if we really want to make readiness a right, we've got to figure out how and when and where cash matters and how much cash kids need in the transition into adulthood and as they move forward. And so a couple of things in the book that I look at that I think are important, and I would love for folks who get the book and, you know, read that chapter. That's a lot of the new stuff. We didn't talk a lot about cash with Ready by Design or other pieces. One is, there is a good possibility of the 74 million kids in the US that many of them will have periods of financial scarcity, and that's across income levels. There is the impact of poverty, but then there is what happens during times of financial stress and stretch in your family. And what do you do to support young people's learning and development in those times? The second is, how do you help young people get by? Including, you know, I put in very specifically, like, I believe in direct cash assistance. I think that we need to do it. I think that our schools need to figure out that even if they're free in public, they're often very expensive, and understanding what things actually cost. And then the last piece is, I actually call for total overhaul of financial aid, not financial aid, I'm sorry, financial literacy. I think that we have a new and different financial cycle, given what's happening in the world and the need to save and spend and credit and debit or debt and all of those pieces, and that we don't actually train young people for that, and give them the knowledge and supports that they need there. So give them cash, teach them about cash.
Yeah. Again, there's some, Dara, you're putting great comments in. I want to make sure they go to all attendees and not just all panelists, but so I won't read it, but ask to sort of repost it. But Dara was just reminding us that cash is often a source of debates in things like service learning, where we want to basically say, well, this is altruism. They just should be volunteering. And we're like, but they need to take the bus and they need to have a sandwich and they, you know. And so I think for me, it just, the intentionality of the language of saying cash, and I'll just take it back to my own kids. I remember our son Timothy we were out at a restaurant or in somebody's house, and he said to one of his friends, "Let me show you how easy it is to get money from my dad." And he just sort of walked up. We're in the middle of conversation. He's like, "Dad, can I have 20 bucks?" And Dad reaches in his wallet and hands him 20 bucks, and he goes back. Now, he's not going to do anything terrible with it, but that ability to have a modest amount of money in your pocket that nobody required you to use for a certain thing, that you can use to support a connection. So your friends are going out for pizza. If you don't have cash, you don't go. those are the kinds of things that when we basically sort of get into the high level of financial aid, et cetera, the dollars are, so many strings are attached to the dollars when you don't have that financial stability that aren't attached when you do. When you're in a family that can say, yeah, here's 20 bucks. That's a big deal. And that allows you to really move around in those other spaces. So I really, really appreciate the framing of all of these as currencies that can, as you said, be both, you know, they can be stockpiled, they can be expended, they can be connected, they connect to each other in a way. I think it's a really fascinating way to sort of bring us into a practical way to talk about what it takes for young people to be ready. What are those things that they need to have in their backpack, in addition to that set of competencies that really help them move through life and be prepared. And that definition of readiness that we looked at together was really sort of just going back to, you know, Webster's definition of readiness when you look it up in the dictionary is about both your capacity to tackle things that are unexpected and your motivation, your willingness. So to be ready, you have to be both willing and you have to be prepared. And those two things go together. And I think your currencies really sort of help shape that out.
Yeah, and I'll just say, as we wrap up the currencies, and I saw there was a question about like system change. So if you do get the book, Making It, and maybe Catherine can post the link again. At the back, Karen and I aren't talking about it today, but there are currency builder practices. And I think that that's a really good start for like, how would we do strategy work or design work in our program or in our system around this? And certainly reach out to me or reach out to the forum. But the rub that's both like unfair and opportune here is that the currencies can compensate for each other. So as Karen knows, I'm one of 5 kids, and I'll just say very quickly, I have a brother, my brother and I both dropped out of school. My one brother never got, my older brother never got a credential, but he is so talented as an artist. And then he met a bunch of famous people, and he had these obscene competencies and connections that actually carried him through. And it made the other pieces, he wasn't always, he didn't always have enough cash, and he didn't have the credentials, but he was able to do it. Similarly, if somebody is very wealthy and knows the right people, then those skills and credentials aren't as important. So that is both unfair, but it's also a good thing for us to think about in terms of how do we support young people where they are, and really see them for what's possible and what can be done in their life, and coming alongside them.
Good. And I'm glad you mentioned the back of the book, because it does get very practical. And we do want to sort of come back to telling people what they really can do when they get off this call, other than order the book, to move these ideas out. I do think they have a value and again, just sort of a grounding to them that people can take them and play with them. And you have a lot of examples in the book that help that, and we all have our own. You know, as we sort of move in to the last couple of minutes, and I'm going to give it back to Catherine in a second to tell us what comes next. But you and I know, because we've known each other for years, when I read the book, I came back to you and I said, I love the book. I'm concerned at this point in time why we're not sort of pulling out more just the incredible inequities that young people are facing as they're going through. So it is a Making It book, and these are all things that young people need to have. But there are incredible differences in the extent how hard it is for them to get them, that are clearly related to race and ethnicity and class and other ways that young people are marginalized. And we had a good conversation about it. So I just wanted to sort of raise that, share that, and have you sort of talk a little bit about that, why you started the book where it is and where you hope to be going next, because I know you haven't finished this journey. And then talk a little bit about whether we want to make it a C or not. But when I think about the framework that you know, the forum and many others have used for 6 or 7 years now, from the University of Chicago Consortium on school research, that sort of framework for young adult success that talks about young people need to have a broad set of competencies. They need to have a sense of agency, and you're clearly sort of getting to that. And they need to have an integrated identity. And when we're really talking about young people who are in these marginalized spaces, how does identity fit in to how they even think about, access, get to these currencies? Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. So I think I'm trying to think of with our time where to sort of start. So I'll start with the end in terms of identity and what wasn't included in the book, because at some point you've got to sort of cut and trim and decide what will this book be as compared to other pieces. So what is it that it offers? And there were some, as Karen knows, there were some really deliberate decisions that were made around that. So the first thing is the difference between expendable resources and what I would call sort of enduring assets. So there are things that young people must acquire that can be, as we've talked about today, they can be learned, they can be earned, they can be lost, they can be gained, right? We can have relationships in our lives that go away or only serve us for a time. Same with cash and competencies and credentials. And that's transactional. That's not the same as character and identity and culture and community, things that should emerge over time and then endure over time. And so what I would say to you and to everybody on the phone is that what I heard over the years was, we just need we are very busy, whether it's young people or folks on the front lines. We know that the world has changed. We have not been able to keep up. Can you please help us in a way that is easy and enjoyable to like read and understand, figure out what we need to know about how the world works as it is, and what our kids, our kids in the collective sense need to play in that world. And so making it is about that baseline. It's more than Maslow, but it really is baseline, right? Like, this is what you need to play, which is different than this is what you need to have a good life. And so if I am at the margins to play, I might need more social sponsors, a credential from Harvard, more competencies. But that doesn't mean that I'm having a good life and flourishing. And for me, that is where collective identity, culture, community, really having a craft lives. And so for us as the adults in these spaces, I think that we have a dual call, because if we only look at one side, it's kind of, you've got to hold both, and making it draws the line somewhere and says, this is readiness for an unfair world. And then there's sort of well-being and well-becoming, which is next. So I would just say that, anybody on the phone, hear me say, this is not a complete picture. It's simply a roadmap of the world as it is, and what kids need to play and how they get it. And that the next piece of work that so many of you are doing, and Karen, you've been doing for years, and we've been doing together, it just wasn't the full book, is what does it look like to have a good, long, livable life? And what does that require in ways that fuel and feed individually and as community? And that gets to the part of how do we come alongside young people in this dual call of navigation and creation, and create new conditions and contexts that are fair and that are equitable.
I really appreciate that answer, Stephanie. And I know in the minute that we have left before I get it back to Catherine, I want to sort of jump in on your need to play versus sort of need to have a great full life. So that difference, that baseline that you talked about. I think to answer the last questions that was just posted about what can adults do, we often talk about the power adults carry. And I think one of the things very practically that we could talk about is adults can say these C's. adults can have this conversation. For young people to really be really empowered by understanding that there are currencies, to have this kind of frame and have a conversation about the importance of competencies. Let's talk about them. The importance of, yes, credentials. And you're in a school where the credential that you're going to get is not going to be as valuable as that school down the road, but we're going to help you get it. Or maybe we're going to help you change schools or get into it. We can have these conversations with young people using a language like this that helps them both understand what they need to have in that backpack, but also really then honestly understand why they don't have it, why some people have it and they don't have it, why when they try to get it, they get rejected. That for me is a part of that collective. So it can really be a collective analysis that adults could be doing by being much more transparent and intentional about talking about what it takes to make it. Because so often young people think what it takes to make it is I have to get this high school diploma. And if I don't get that, I didn't make it. We're leaving it a chance for young people to really figure out on their own what it means to make it and whether they have what it takes to make it rather than having these conversations. So I would end it with, yes, readiness for an unfair world is what Nate wrote in. And I think those are the kind of conversations when Rob Jaggers at Castle talks about transformative social emotional learning, it's not just about let's double down on skills. It's let's take those abilities and talk about that ability to analyze. And this is a real tool for that. So I appreciate the conversation. It was wonderful to have you. We're out of time as always. I'm going to give it back to Catherine for the last minute.
Thanks, Karen.
Wonderful. I feel like I say it every month, but just a great in-depth conversation that has me thinking about what comes next. But more tactically, what comes next for the readiness projects are the continuation of both this series and our Making the Invisible Visible series. So that we hope that you will all join us on April 20th for our next Making the Invisible Visible session, Investing in Adolescence, a Summer Perspective from Chicago. And I'm dropping that registration link in the chat. And then we'll be back here for our next Changing the Odds session on May 12th at 12:30. Registration for that will be opening soon, and Karen will engage with David Adams from the Urban Assembly during that conversation. So thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to connecting with all of you again very soon.
Thank you.